Welcome to the podcast series at the College of Education and Integrative Studies. I'm Jeff Pass. I'm the Dean of the College, Cal Poly Pomona. And we have as our guest today Dr. Alvero Huerta, Associate Professor of Ethnic and Women's Studies, and also a faculty member in the College of Environmental Studies, Environmental Science. Welcome, Dr. Huerta.
Welcome, Dean Paz, and I appreciate you having me here today.
Yes, well, we're always excited to have you join us. Your first podcast was a big success. This time around, we have some new things to talk about, and in particular, as a strong advocate for ethnic and women's studies, you've had some recent successes in the political arena recently. Tell us about it.
Yes, thank you. I appreciate that. Recently, the Governor Newsom, signed a bill where ethnic studies is required at the CSU level statewide, where every single campus must have a 3-unit ethnic studies requirement for undergrads to graduate. So that was a major success for us as faculty of color, and those of us who our expertise is in ethnic studies.
Why is this so important? What's the need for such a course?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, as you know, given your education background as a specialist in education, California is a very diverse state, and the majority of CSU campuses, including ours, are very diverse. But the majority are Hispanic service institutions, where about 40% of our student population are Latino or Latina. So for those of us from that community, Latino, Latina, and also African Americans and Asians and Pacific Islanders, Native Americans, the fact that we live in California, the fact that diversity is important to us, we wanted to see that reflected in our curricula, and we wanted to see that reflected in the population that we serve. So for us, ethnic studies is not just a question of 3-unit course, but it has to do with teaching all students of ethnic backgrounds the importance of our diversity, and that every single group has had a significant role in the development of this country, whether they're recognized or not.
So let's talk about some of that recognition. A lot of people grew up taking social studies classes. That's my area of expertise, social studies education. And they learned what I think could charitably be called the white supremacist version of American history, told basically through the lens of the white settlers moving across the country. That's something that this bill will impact, perhaps?
Oh, yes, definitely. I mean, you raised a great question, and I really appreciate how you're very open-minded and allow for different discourse to take place. The fact of the matter is that in terms of public education, and I'm a product of public education from K to 12 and LAUSD and also my University of California degrees. And growing up, what I found was when it came to the case of Mexican Americans, it was a footnote. The only thing I learned about African Americans was about slavery and Martin Luther King. Everything else was told through the perspective of this Eurocentric perspective of great white men make history. Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves, for example. FDR brought us Social Security and the New Deal, and everything that comes with it. So this is how history has been told. I'm a history major from UCLA. And unfortunately, that's not the way history works. I'm more of a Howard Zinn, people's history, where history is really from the bottom up. It's people demanding history, and there's a lot of untold stories beyond Martin Luther King that we need to study, and for us to become citizens of the world, we need to study all histories from all perspectives. I love movies, for example, And even in movies, we see this white savior narrative, like the movie The Help, for example, where this white woman gives voice to the black domestic workers, which is important to me because my mother was a domestic worker. Or McFarlane, where this white savior comes and has these migrant workers become world-class runners. And so we see history through this perspective, and we see education through this perspective. We learned that George Washington is our father, never told a lie, and all these narratives. And for those of us who are not part of that history, unfortunately, we feel that we don't belong or that we don't have a voice. So this is why ethnic studies is important. And it's not until you gain some type of consciousness when you realize that there's something wrong with this education and the way it's taught, and it doesn't have to be this way.
So it's just really, I'm a curriculum, as you know, I'm a curriculum person,
Right.
And what we teach, has a tremendous impact on young people's psyches, sense of themselves, their pride. So it goes without saying that children of color, students of color, will feel better about themselves and their ethnicity as a result of this kind of course. But what about the effect on the majority white culture? Some people view this as divisive.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see it that way?
Mm-hmm. I don't see it that way. That's a great point. Ethnic studies is not an ethnic studies problem. It's an American problem. And I think if Americans are more open-minded, I'm an American, I was born here. So if Americans are more open-minded, they'll see that we all benefit and that our strength is our diversity and not the other way around. And by learning about other people and other cultures, we all become better citizens, we become better residents, and we become better human beings. It's not enough for us to say, well, I'm not a racist because I have a black friend, or I like Mexican food, or I go to Panda. It has to do with being open-minded and learning about other people and not seeing that one group of people is superior to others and that we all have a contribution. And it's more, so we can be different, but it doesn't mean that we're unequal. And unfortunately, the K-12 education, the university education teaches us that we're different, but the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant are superior to others because the curriculum is taught that way. The books that we read are taught that way. The instructors that we have in front of us look that way. So diversity benefits all of us, regardless of the color of our skin and our background.
Right. So students who learn this new ethnic studies curriculum will have their minds broadened because they'll see things from multiple perspectives, and that is the purpose of history is not just to tell the story, but to see things from different perspectives and piece it all together like a jigsaw puzzle. And up till now, the jigsaw puzzle has been missing a lot of pieces. That's going to change. But how will it take place at Cal Poly Pomona? I know it's still in process, but what do you envision happening?
Well, what I'm hoping is that those that oppose ethnic studies on our campus and across the state, including the leadership statewide, recognize that one, it's the law, and number two, that this is something that has been brewing for 50 years. So in the late 60s, in 68, San Francisco State University had a strike. It was a Third World Liberation Front where different ethnic groups, African American, Asian American, Latino American, Native American, came together and had a strike to demand ethnic studies at San Francisco State University. And then in 1969, we had a similar strike. Not that I was around, I was born back then, but I wasn't a faculty back then. It's like a joke with my students. I talk about Lincoln or slavery. I said, well, I wasn't born back then, but so for us, it goes back to that history dates back 50 years of self-determination, that these courses and the curricula needs to change, and it needs to reflect the population, the demographics of America, and that all voices need to be heard, need to be read, and need to be taught, not just in the curricula, but also within the faculty members themselves. Uh, like I, like I said before, I was born here, and all my schooling was in public education. You know, I attended the best universities of the world, and I teach at a great university. And I, I must admit that I only had one African American professor in my entire many years of education, and it's unfortunate. Uh, and because I want to experience and I want to learn from different people, from different cultures, from different experiences, even if I'm not that. So I don't have to be African American to feel sad or feel angry when Mr. George Floyd was murdered. And I want to learn from other cultures and other people, and I want young people to do as well, and so that we have like a holistic education where we all benefit from it.
Okay, so what are the steps that are going to be followed in implementing this law at Cal Poly Pomona, and is that going to be different from the other CSUs?
That's something that we're working on at the moment. And fortunately for us, those of us who fought for ethnic studies, and I'm one of those leaders that demanded ethnic studies through AB 1460. But I recognize that there were people, or there are people that have been doing this for more time than I have. The Council of Ethnic Studies, for example. And so I pretty much follow what they say in terms of the actual curricula and the implementation. And what I'm hearing today is that we're not seeing the cooperation that we need. So a lot of the implementation that's taking place now, or the pace that is occurring, is very unilateral and is very top down. So whatever we end up, what we come up with at the statewide and then at the local, it should be in the spirit of collaboration with the Council of Ethnic Studies and those leaders that have been doing this for many years, 4 or 5 years, 6 years. I've been in this struggle for about a year, and given my organizing background, I'm very fierce and uncompromising. But I recognize that my strength is not in the curricula, so I would defer to those that my colleagues that have that strength. But what I'm hearing today is that, unfortunately, the way it's being implemented is not in the spirit or in the letter of the law.
Yeah. Well, let's hope that it works out well. Mm-hmm. But you did mention your advocacy, and
sure.
You have a long history of advocating on behalf of various groups. I believe when we spoke last, you were just involved in Pomona, allowing vendors to set up on the streets. How has that evolved? Is that still an issue?
Yes, unfortunately, it's still an issue. I mean, what we see today in the case of street vendors, and the majority, and when we're looking at LA and LA County, Pomona, Cal Poly Pomona is part of LA County, is that with the pandemic, there's this idea that everybody's been impacted, and it's true. But what is also true is that not everybody has been impacted equally. So immigrants have been impacted at a greater rate in terms of contracting COVID and losing their jobs. Those in the informal economy have been hurt more. Black and brown people have been hurt more. If you live in very crowded housing, for example, if somebody gets COVID, everybody gets COVID. If you live in a middle class home where everybody has their room and you can isolate somebody, then somebody gets COVID that they can they can be quarantined. So unfortunately for street vendors, the most vulnerable population among us in terms of immigrants, the case goes for others in terms of day laborers. I don't think the city and the county has prioritized, their particular needs. And this is kind of related, or not kind of, but this is related to ethnic studies and in teaching young people, and also not everybody's young at Cal Poly in terms of the students. There's a lot of returning students, which is fine too. It, is to try to understand how systemic racism works, and how even within COVID, we see how disproportionately Black and Brown communities are being impacted. And so that we should come together and have a sense of solidarity and reach out to those that are most in need and address those needs. And in the case with street vendors, I don't think the city of LA in particular, I don't think they're doing a good job in responding to those needs.
Have you included students in some of this advocacy work that you do?
For students, what I've tried to do is try to make sure that they understand the importance of ethnic studies, systemic racism, and understand the fact of the matter is that young people today have always played a major role in these type of movements, social movements, just like those in the 70s, in the 60s, that were the ones that stopped the war in Vietnam, for example. It's always young people, it's always students that play a major role because they have access to books and to knowledge, and they have that luxury of time that allows them to reflect. So what I try to do is just encourage them to look beyond individual cases and look at things at a systemic level, and to channel their resources constructively. It's very easy to get depressed and to have anxiety when you see Black boys and men being killed on TV. Even myself, I could not watch George Floyd being tortured for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. So that for me, the question is, how is it that we come together, not based on our race, but based on our consciousness or our values? So what I try to stress with my students and with everybody even my colleagues, is to teach them that we need to appreciate our differences. And if we are to come together, we should reflect on the ideals and the values that bring us together. So I always stress to them, what brings me hope is when we see the people protesting the murder of George Floyd, is there's Black people, there's white people, there's Asians and Native Americans and others. And that is what we should focus on in terms of those forces that are trying to dismantle systemic racism. Because even if you have white privilege, you're still a victim of that. So we want to dismantle it for everybody.
So there were critics who would say that that's not the purpose of education.
Mm-hmm.
The purpose of education is to prepare people for careers and give them the basic knowledge about history and science and mathematics. Is that your view?
I understand that view, but my view is more with John Dewey and Paulo Freire, the Brazilian educator, where education can be used as a way of transforming the world. Education, like any institution, can be used to oppress people or to liberate them. So historically, education has been used as a way for those of us that come from marginalized communities as a way to experience upward mobility. This is a case for white working class community members that entered World War II and the Korean War, and they benefited from the GI Bill, where for the first time they were the first to go to college. So I think education is the great equalizer in allowing for working class, let's say whites, African Americans, and Latinos, to reach that education and to gain that privilege. So what I tell people is that if you're born with privilege, or we have that privilege that I do and yourself and others, even though they don't feel it, the fact of the matter is not everybody is going to go to the university. So for me, is to embrace that privilege but use that privilege for good. So I think that is universal, right? So whatever privilege that we have accumulated, to use it for the benefit of those that don't have that privilege, and not to perpetuate our own privilege or the status quo. So I think that university has always viewed historically that perspective in terms of having it serve the public. Unfortunately, historically, it hasn't always been that case, right? It's always been, I got mine, and that's it. But for me, it's a question of, you have privilege, that's fine. I don't have any problem with that. I have privilege myself, but it's how you use that privilege. So for me, is using our privilege for the public good.
So part of the challenge that we face, as you've mentioned, is not everybody goes to college.
Right.
Not everybody's going to have the benefit of an ethnic studies course, which seems to be what's going to happen. What do we do about the vast majority of society that does not have access to these kinds of wonderful courses?
Well, I think we have to get away from this idea that like college is not for everybody. I mean, this is something this is a narrative that has been perpetuated, and especially in Black and brown communities. And I don't think that's true. I think that college we need to be more democratic when it comes to the university, and have equal access and have equity, which is not the case. Unfortunately, like even within Black and brown communities, there's been this idea, this program that is only like the top 10%. And I was part of that top 10%, and I benefited from that, going to UCLA and then later UC Berkeley. And to me, it's kind of like class suicide, where even though I benefited from it, I don't think it's right. So I think we need to invert that triangle, right? And so that everybody has that opportunity, so that it's not just a question of, when the message is like college is not for everybody, that it's only targeted to Black and brown communities, where the Army and the military and ROTC is focused on recruiting from those communities, but they don't do the same at Beverly Hills High School or San Marino High School. So for me, it's a question of doing away with the way we've been doing things, and creating more of a democratic institution of higher education where everybody has the opportunity, and those that do not have the opportunity, that with the implementation or re-implementation of affirmative action, have that as well. I don't want to be, as a Mexican American, as part of the servant class, and just seen as, wow, you just go to vocational schools and be happy with that, or as long as only 10% of you make it, then be happy with that. I don't believe in that. I think the universities across the state should reflect our population, and at the moment they're not.
Is there more that can be done to bring young people of color into colleges and universities? Are there policy changes that you would advocate for?
Yes, I think so. I think the over-reliance on standardized testing, for example, is a big issue. Unfortunately, once again, for me, it's a personal. I went to public schools, and they were not the best public schools, so they didn't prepare me for the SATs. Fortunately, I went to Upper Bound, so Occidental College, so I had a little bit of an edge. But for my childhood friends, they never had a chance. Because the schools that they went to were underfunded, overcrowded, and there weren't role models. There weren't people that looked like them that could tell them they could do it. So there was never an opportunity to do that. Most of their parents didn't go to the university like mine. So when you start at that level, the only way we can equalize it is that we have to shift from that existing paradigm. And it's not fair to say, wow, you just have to work harder, or you just didn't study hard enough. But the fact of the matter, if your parents went to the university, if your parents are middle class and they have access to private tutors, to these test programs where they help you get good scores on the SATs, and you already have that advantage over somebody who doesn't. So unfortunately, our system perpetuates that. Even at the Cal State level, many of our campuses are impacted. Engineering, for example, is very, very difficult to get into at Cal Poly Pomona. Also, architectures were highly impacted. So for me, it's a question of everybody that applies that has that opportunity. And unfortunately, those that do apply and get in, they inherently had an opportunity based on where they were born and what class they were born into. So to me, that's not what's fair. And I think we have to dismantle that or do away with that and reinvest in our education, which is not happening.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that's happened at Cal Poly Pomona as a result of COVID-19 is they've discontinued looking at least temporarily, looking at the SAT and the ACT because they haven't been able to conduct those tests. And we have a new model of admissions, and that turns out to be more effective at diversifying the student body. So these are the kinds of unanticipated consequences of COVID-19 that I think will benefit our society and the university.
Oh, definitely. I mean, I think looking at students holistically, it's a better approach. If we just look at numbers, numbers don't tell the whole story. Like I said, usually it just tells what class you belong to, what privilege you belong to. And I say this personally, my son grew up in privilege. Both of his parents have graduate degrees. So it's not something that I'm divorced from. But for me, I'm not worried about my son so much. I'm worried about those kids that within COVID and within Zoom and everything that we're doing don't even have access to the internet, or don't even have their own room to study, or don't even have a computer. And so to me, and those little things that might seem little to those of us who take those things for granted, it creates inequality from the beginning to the end. So moving away from standardized testing and GPAs, I'm not saying that they shouldn't be used, at least the GPAs. I'm not saying that, but what I'm arguing is that we have to look at candidates holistically, and then we have to see what privileges people come with and the lack of privileges that people come with. And if they don't score high or they don't have a 4.0, it's not a reflection of them or their work ethic. It has to do with the parents don't have a college education. They can't help them. They don't have money. They can't have a private tutor. They went to overcrowded schools like I did. So it's not an even playing field. So if we take away these metrics like the GRE or the SAT, it allows us to see the student more holistically versus just looking at them in terms of numbers, because numbers lie and they can be manipulated.
Yeah. Well, you've certainly, I know that you serve as a senator and you serve on various committees around the university. So you are in a good position now to help to influence some of the changes that you've been talking about in this last half hour. I thank you for your service. I thank you for your leadership. And I thank you for joining us in the podcast today.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate it. And I thank you for your leadership and being very open-minded and in allowing for different voices and different people to speak and speak their truth. We don't have to agree with everything we say, but to hear from different perspectives from different people that come from different backgrounds. And I think that's what makes Cal Poly Pomona great, is that we embrace our diversity. If we look at our leadership is very diverse, and that's what I like. It's not something that's monolithic, but it's diverse. And to me, being at Cal Poly is like being at home. This is something that I appreciate.
Yeah. Well, thank you again for joining us.
Okay, thank you.